How are we doing this morning, church? You can probably bring that down a touch. I'm pretty loud. He's onto it. I tell you, it's not often that... thank you. It's not often that I get to say this because I'm usually preaching each week. And by the way, just in case, I'm Matt. If you're visiting, I'm the pastor here. I'm not the security guard, as someone thought a couple of weeks ago. I'm also not the homeless person that the church is being kind to. Someone thought that this week, I think. I was sitting out there in the sun with my thongs on and tracksuit pants, and I had like a lunch bowl, and I think they were like, "Oh, isn't that cute? The church's so good. They're looking after this guy." But it's not often because I preach week in, week out that I get to say this, but it's a tough act to follow this week. I don't know if you were in church last week, but we were blessed with Ladee and Lindsay bringing the word. And if you didn't hear it, it's on our Facebook page. It's also on our YouTube channel, and it's very much worth checking out. So we'll see how we go. Tough act to follow. Well, there's no prizes this morning for guessing what our theme is. If you were even half paying attention during that passage, you will have guessed that yes, this morning we're talking about forgiveness. And as we conclude our series today, entitled We Walk, it's been a series about the sorts of things that need to characterize the way we journey together, the way we walk together as a church family. And I wanted to end our series today with something that I think that not only needs to shape the way or characterize the way we walk together as a church family, but something that I think that is disproportionately important or has a disproportionate amount of significance for the faith journey of every Christian as a whole. Something I think often is actually poorly understood, yet something that I think when we practice well has the opportunity to change us into the person of Christ like few other things. So let's dive in this morning as we unpack some things and some central ideas around why it's so important that we walk with forgiveness. Now, the word to forgive, most often used in the New Testament, which is the word which has been used several times in our passage this morning, is the word aphiame. Aphiame comes from two Greek root words. The first is the word apo, which means away from, and the second is the word hemi, which means to send. So aphiame, literally speaking, meant to send away from. You see, the act of forgiveness in the first century was something that was always centered around the cancelling or pardoning of a debt. If someone was forgiven a debt, they would come to a meeting with their creditor. Their creditor would produce their account. It would outline their debt. And if they were to be forgiven of their debt, then they would be released. They would be let go. They would be forgiven that part of their debt or their whole debt. And they would literally and then physically be sent away from their debt. The debt would remain with the creditor and they would be sent away from their debt. To forgive meant to cancel or to let go a person from their debt by voluntarily not demanding it. Remember the parable that Jesus told in Luke 16 about the dishonest manager? There's a manager, right? And he has a boss. And it's his job to look after all of the boss's wealth and resources. And the boss finds out that this manager isn't being very responsible in the way he's using the money. He's wasting it. He's probably using it on himself. And the boss says, you know what, I'm going to fire that guy. And the manager hears about this before he's fired. And he goes, man, what am I going to do? I'm too old to go and work, do physical labor. And it says in the Bible, he says that I'm too proud to beg. And so he comes up with this cunning plan. He says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to forgive a bunch of my boss's debtors. I'm going to forgive a portion of their debt so that when I get fired, there are people who feel obliged to kind of take care of me and look after me. And so remember the story? He calls them in one by one. He says to the first, let's look at your account. Here it is. What does it say? 1,000 bushels of wheat. Okay, quick, let's change that to 800 bushels of wheat. And then he sends them away from a portion of their debt. The second person, what does yours say? Let's look at your account. 500 gallons of olive oil. All right, quick, let's change that to 250 gallons of olive oil. And he forgives each one of these debtors a portion of their debt. And this is what it means to forgive in the Bible. To release or cancel a debt. However, I think this is where both the power and the confusion comes around this topic of forgiveness. You see, you don't often find in the 21st century people talking about releasing someone from a debt or asking to be released from a debt, do you? Could you imagine if we caught up with coffee, you and me? We're sitting down, we're having a laugh, we're kicking it. Now, for all the older people, that just means we're hanging out. See, I teach you things. We're kicking it, we're chatting, we're having fun. And I'm asking you about your weekend. I'm like, what did you get up to? What did you do? And you're telling me. And then you turn the conversation around. And you go, well, what about you, Matt? Well, what did you get up to? Could you imagine if I said, you know what? I took the kids to the park. And then I washed the car. And then I cancelled a debt of Bianca's. That's my wife, by the way, Bianca, if you're visiting. You'd be like, what? And then imagine I said, yeah, but the best part, after dinner, she released me from a debt. You'd be like, man, what is this cult, weird, like marriage going on here, releasing each other from debts? You see, as 21st century Christians, we often treat forgiveness more like an admission of guilt, right? Where the word, will you forgive me? The phrase, will you forgive me, is more like translated like, okay, I admit I was in the wrong. Or yes, I forgive you is translated more like, okay, seeing as you're prepared to admit fault, I'm prepared to move on. Isn't that more the kind of picture of how we treat forgiveness in the 21st century? A phrase that's connected to the admission of being at fault. Yet when the Bible talks about forgiveness, it unequivocally is talking about the release or cancellation of a debt. And this is incredibly important. Because literally the whole of the Christian faith is underpinned or is predicated on forgiveness, the release and cancellation of a debt. Our entire faith is built upon God cancelling our insurmountable debt that comes as a result of sin. Now stay with me for a second. Don't tune out just yet. Because as soon as we hear the word sin, we typically assume we know what's coming next. It's some moral lecture that you're about to get and a bunch of condemnation. You see, most Christians think that sin is fundamentally about, being bad. It's the word that we use to describe a person who breaks some special religious standard. However, the word sin wasn't even a religious word originally. Nor did it have anything to do with morality. The word sin used in the Old Testament is the word katar. And it came from the world of archery. And it means to miss the mark. If an archer shot at a bullseye and missed it, whether they missed it by a tiny bit or turn around and shot the person behind them, Adam would do that. It It was called sin, right? Missing the mark. Or failing because you missed the mark. And there are a number of places in the Old Testament that we come across this word in its broad and original meaning. In Judges 20 verse 16, Israel is about to start a civil war. The tribe of Benjamin, one of Israel's tribes, they've gotten into a conflict over something awful that's happened. And they're about to start this civil war. And the writer of Judges is wanting the reader to understand Benjamin's military capacity. And so they write this. Among Benjamin's elite troops, 700 were left-handed, and each of them could sling a rock and hit a target within a hair's breadth without missing. It's the word kata, without sinning. They were so good that they could whack someone with a rock and they wouldn't miss. What about in Proverbs 19 verse 2? Solomon writes, "Desire without knowledge is not good. How much more will hasty feet miss the way?" Kata. How much more will hasty feet sin, miss the mark? You see, fundamentally, the word for sin wasn't about being bad or immoral per se. It was simply about missing the mark or failing to hit the standard that God intended for His creation. So, if sin is about missing the mark or failing to reach a standard, then what is that standard? What is the metaphorical bullseye we're supposed to be hitting? Well, essentially, it's just this. That A, that we would love and honor God, and B, that we would love and honor His image bearers, i.e., each other. That's it. Remember when Jesus was questioned by one of the religious experts about what was the greatest commandment? And what does he say? He gives a 2-for-1 deal. He says that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and strength, and that you would love your neighbor as yourself. He says all of the prophets, all of the law, everything that's gone before hangs on these two things. You see, God's bullseye, if you will, is simply that we would love and honor both God and one another. Anything outside of that is sin, is missing the mark. And so the famous 10 commandments that we read about in Exodus, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not worship any other god but me, thou shalt not commit adultery. Far from being about a moral code we're supposed to strive for morality's sake, these were actually instructions about ways to prevent us from missing the mark, failing to reach God's standard, God's bullseye of loving and honoring both Him and other humans. Thou shalt not commit adultery, for example, is less about morality in and of itself and more about that when this happens, when adultery happens, when a person breaks the sacred intimacy and trust that they pledged and committed to in marriage, that this doesn't bestow on the other person the honor and the love that God desires for them. And so sin, because it misses the mark, God has an issue with it. And the issue isn't just that, oh, we missed the mark and we should try a little bit harder. It's that ultimately, sin has consequences. You see, every time we sin, we accrue a debt. Every time we worship money, or we worship success, or our career, or beauty, or popularity, or whatever it is for you, in the place of God, we miss the mark. We sin and we accrue a debt. Every time we lie to a colleague or gossip about someone, we miss the mark. We accrue a debt. Every time we prioritize our needs and our preferences, practice self-interest instead of serving our neighbor, we sin and we miss the mark. And like the man in our story, we begin to accrue an insurmountable debt. But listen to this. The reason why God is so concerned about us missing the mark, the reason God is so concerned about our sin, isn't because He's longing for lots of good religious Christians. It's because our debt, the consequences of our sin, ultimately separate us from God. Paul says in Romans 6:23 that the wages of sin is death. And he's not just talking about physical death, he's talking about eternal spiritual death. God doesn't want you to be good for morality's sake. He wants you to avoid sin, avoid missing the mark, because He loves you. Because He knows that the debt of sin, that the wages of sin, is permanent separation from Him. You see, sometimes I think we kind of get this idea in our head. I know I had this as a kid. That the wages of sin is death meant more like, every time I missed the mark or every time I failed, every time I continued to accrue a debt, that God would get angrier and angrier until in one final huff of disgust, He kind of just said, well, the wages of your sin, man, is death. You're so bad, you deserve to die. And I'm not sure why, as humans, we keep trying to make sin purely a moral issue, where sin equals bad equals death, right? And I'm not saying it doesn't involve morality, but I think a more helpful understanding is that sin equals distance, which eventually gives way to death. You see, when we miss the mark, when we miss the bullseye of love, the bullseye of life, the bullseye of God Himself, it's our distance, it's our continual estrangement from Him that ultimately causes death. I think it's less about God pronouncing the judgment of death on us and more about us reaping the consequences of choosing to separate ourselves from the very source of love and life. And this is why the gospel is such good news, right? 2 people think that. It's not because our insurmountable debt doesn't lead to death, because it does. And it's not because Jesus won't one day judge between His sheep and His goats, choose those who are with Him and those who aren't, because one day He will. The reason the gospel is such good news is because God loved you so much, God loved me so much, that He sent His one and only Son to save us, to reunite us to Himself, to pay the debt of our sin. That is in Jesus, in faith and acceptance of Him dying on the cross on behalf of our sin for our debt, that we are forgiven. That we are literally sent away from our debt. That we're not held accountable, that we're released, that we're acquitted from every past, present, and future attempt or failed attempt to love and honor God. Isn't that good news? It certainly is. And I think it's where most Christians, including myself sometimes, would like the story to end. But it doesn't. was a woman by the name of Samara Alinejad. Samara Alinejad was an Iranian woman. And she had 2 sons. The youngest of her son died in a violent accident. Several years later, her one and only baby boy, now an 18-year-old, was killed by that man. You see, her son got into a fight with this guy. And what was supposed to just be a physical altercation turned into something a lot more nasty. You see, this guy got out a knife and decided instead to stab Samara Alinejad's son and keep stabbing him until he eventually died. And something that you may not know about Iran is that not only does Iran still allow the death penalty, but it's one of few places in the whole world where they actually still have public executions. What they would do is bring the person, this is a photo of them bringing the man to a public square where there's lots of people watching, willing, and that right there is Selena Alinejad. And at the point in this ceremony, for want of a better words, there's this Iranian culture, almost privilege for them, that when the prosecutor is killed, they're hung, right? And they stand there on a chair with a noose around their neck. And it's the right, almost the privilege of the victim's family, Samara Alinejad, to pull out the chair from underneath the feet of her son's killer. And this is a photo of her walking up to the stage. It's gotten to the point in this ceremony where it's time for the deed to happen. Time eventually, finally, for her to get some justice. And I can't imagine the grief, the anguish in her heart that she must have felt as she stepped up to the stage, seeing her son's killer, knowing that her baby boy would never, ever be reunited with her again in this life. And as she's brought up to this stage, she walks over to this man who has a noose around his neck, and she goes to grab the chair to finally give herself some closure. And yet instead, she slaps the man and she begins to take the noose off his neck. You see, there's only one person in the Iranian penal system that can acquit this man from his guilt. And it's Samara Alinejad. She forgives him. She cancels his debt. And rather than having an avenue for her anger and her grief and her justice to freely outwork through the death of her son's killer, which was her right, she chooses instead to voluntarily bear it herself. Rather than allowing her son's killer to reap the consequences and the guilt of his actions, which he deserved, she chooses instead to carry the burden herself. And family, this is a picture of what biblical forgiveness is. It's not simply accepting an admission of guilt. It's not even choosing to release someone from a debt purely just to move on, to be the bigger man, as we'd say in Australia. It's prepared to suffer on their behalf the injustice of their sin. It's being prepared to cancel their debt at personal cost to yourself in an effort to fight for their good, to fight for their flourishing, to fight for their salvation. You know, Jesus didn't deserve to suffer for our sin, did he? To suffer the injustice of paying for a debt which he neither incurred nor was liable for. But through that act of forgiveness, salvation came. Through it, the kingdom of God broke out and brought life for all of humanity. Friends, I'm not saying that forgiveness is easy. And I'm not saying that you'll even necessarily ever forget the pain or be free from the consequences that came as a result of the injustice you suffered. I'm certainly not, hear me, I'm certainly not saying that we're called to be a doormat that allows others to continually hurt or abuse us. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, however, is that forgiveness is the doorway to salvation. It's the mechanism that allows, that extends the kingdom of God, God's love, God's salvation work here on earth to a broken and a dying world. I don't know where you're at this morning. I don't know the awful things that you've had to suffer unjustly under, or the awful words you've had to suffer unjustly under. Maybe it was a family member. Maybe it was a friend. Maybe even likely it was someone here in this room. Irrespective, I believe God is calling us to be men and women who forgive, to cancel the debt, to release the demand of justice in our heart. Not because what happened is okay, it's not. And it never will be. But because our preparedness to love the person despite the sin continues the very work of salvation that you and I are beneficiaries of. You know, one of the things that grieves my heart is the state of the church in the 21st century. We wonder why the church seems to have lost its power. Why the gospel doesn't seem to be the good news to our world that it's supposed to be. We don't seem as Christians in general to be the salt of the earth, or to be a light on a hill that people are flocking to. And I think it's because we spend more time and energy conforming to the world around us than conforming to Jesus. You know what breaks my heart? The Christian divorce rate is almost identical to our society's divorce rate. In fact, research and statistics will tell you that what Christians do with their time, what Christians do with their money, what Christians do with their energy and resources is literally, for the most part, identical to those around us who don't profess to seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. And church, if we're going to be vessels that bring forth the kingdom of God, to be people who extend the work of salvation through the way we forgive, a salvation work that we have already received freely through through divine forgiveness, then our forgiveness cannot look like the world's. It has to be different. It has to be more radical. It can't be about an admission of guilt or even the release of a debt just to purely move on. It has to be the kind of otherworldly, Christ-like forgiveness that's not only prepared to cancel a debt, but suffer the injustice of being the one committed to bringing life and salvation for people as utterly undeserving of such an act of grace as you and I. There is life and salvation for this community, for the community of Bride, but it's on the other side of our forgiveness. Let's pray.